Your little real estate game ends here. Those words burned into my mind and refused to fade. The voice belonged to my brother-in-law, Brian Irving. He was sitting in the plaintiff's seat with a triumphant look on his face. He had whispered that poison into my ear just minutes ago, right before the hearing began. He entered the Chicago courtroom with his family in tow, passing by me for only a fleeting instant. They were here to strip me of my autonomy through a malicious conservatorship petition. But Brian didn't realize that I wasn't playing a game, I was closing a deal. Have you ever had a family member try to take credit for something you built alone? Let me know your story down in the comments. I'd love to know who's part of our community. Brian's counsel, a man named Henderson with a voice like polished gravel and a suit that cost more than my first apartment, rose to his feet. He adjusted his glasses and looked at me with a performative pity that made my skin crawl. That is how you start a character assassination, with fake sympathy. He began to speak about Sydney Manning. He spoke about me as if I were a tragic case study, not a woman who had spent 8 years building an empire from nothing. The courtroom was silent, the kind of heavy Chicago silence that usually precedes a storm. He used phrases that were designed to strip me of my humanity. He told the judge that I was impulsively unstable. He claimed that I suffered from extreme emotional fluctuations, alternating between cold calculation and reckless instability. Then he dropped the diagnosis they had spent thousands of dollars to manufacture: early onset memory loss. They wanted the court to believe that I was a ghost in my own skin, a danger to my own assets. The lawyer paced the floor, his heels clicking against the oak panels with an arrogant rhythm. He presented a narrative where every success I had was actually a sign of my sickness. He described my late nights at the office as manic episodes. He described my careful investments as impulsive gambles that just happened to pay off. He wanted to redefine my sanity until it fit their greed. I sat there, but I did not cry. I did not ask why. Anger was not loud this time, it was clinical. I looked at my parents, Charles and Karen, sitting in the front row. My father, Charles, was nodding stiffly at every lie, his face set in a mask of stern concern that he had perfected over decades. My mother, Karen, watched me with a gaze that held no warmth, only a cold expectation of my failure. She was clutching a monogrammed handkerchief, looking for all the world like a grieving mother, but her eyes were calculating. I realized then that they did not see a daughter, they saw a resource that needed to be managed, a problem that needed to be solved so they could keep their social standing intact. I had been the silent investor in their version of family for years, footing the bill for their pride while they discarded my dreams. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for too long. Now, they were trying to initiate a hostile takeover of my life. The lawyer pivoted to the lakefront estate, $3,200,000. He claimed that this property was purchased during one of my rare rational phases. He stated that at the time, I had explicitly promised this home to the whole family as a sanctuary, a place where Charles and Karen could retire in peace and Brittany could host her socialite galas. He argued that my current refusal to share it was merely proof of my latest unstable phase. It was flawless logical armor. According to them, I was sane enough to sign a contract that gave them what they wanted, but too crazy to hold on to the title. I looked at Brittany. My sister wore a satisfied smile that she didn't even try to hide. She looked radiant, dressed in a silk dress that my tuition money probably paid for years ago. Beside her, Brian sat with his arms crossed, his eyes saying clearly that they were the ones who wrote the story of my life. They dismissed the blood, sweat, and tears of my 8 years of work as nothing more than a game. They truly believed in the illusion they had created, the image of a pitiful, incompetent Sydney standing on the brink of ruin. I rubbed my eyes, not out of exhaustion, but to sharpen my focus. The hallway outside probably smelled like winter, but in here, it smelled like old paper and silence. There was no regret in the room, only a balance sheet. They thought they were witnessing the end of my real estate game. They had no idea they were looking at the foundation of a fortress they would never be allowed to enter. I reached for my leather portfolio with hands as steady as the Chicago skyline. I didn't answer a single look. I just went back to my internal accounting. This wasn't revenge, it was a final audit. A memory from 8 years ago stabbed into my mind like a knife. I could almost smell the mahogany and the thick, cloying scent of my father's expensive cigars. In my parents' living room, surrounded by furniture that cost more than a year of my life, my father's voice had rung out with a finality that chilled me to the bone. He told me they had decided to stop paying my college tuition after that term. Nicole's wedding was expensive, and Brittany needed a debutante season that would secure her place in the Chicago elite. He looked me in the eye and said that investing in me any further would be a waste of his capital. My mother followed without a second of hesitation. She told me I had no talent and that I should find someone suitable to marry as soon as possible. At that moment, I understood the hierarchy of our bloodline. In that household, I was the first to be discarded. My dreams and my efforts held no value compared to my sister's wedding decorations or my parents' social image. I was a line item that had been slashed to balance the books of Brittany's vanity. This was the trap of cruel normalization. Over 20 years, they had trained themselves to see me as a utility, a resource that existed only to be redirected toward their golden child. Because I was quiet, they assumed I was empty. Because I was reliable, they assumed I was an infinite well of compliance. They had normalized the idea that my pain was just a necessary byproduct of their pleasure. To them, my college education was a luxury, but Brittany's $100,000 party was a fundamental right. At the bottom of that cold despair, I made a quiet vow. I would rely on no one. I would let no one decide my worth. Absolute financial power would be my armor and my sword. That was when my little real estate game began. But it was never a game. It was a lonely, brutal fight for survival. I moved into a studio apartment in a district that the city had forgotten. It smelled like damp paint, exhaust, and ancient silence. I didn't cry. I didn't beg for them to change their minds. I worked 3 jobs simultaneously, forcing my way forward like carving a path through a frozen wilderness. I was a waitress by day, a courier by evening, and a night shift janitor in the very buildings I would one day own. While they mocked my faded clothes and my tired eyes, I lived in public libraries, devouring textbooks on economics, structural mechanics, and property law. I lived on 1 slice of bread and black coffee per day. I juggled part-time shifts and saved every penny. While Brittany was touring venues in Tuscany, I was learning how to negotiate personally with contractors and rebuild repair plans to cut costs by 30%. My battle continued quietly, unnoticed by anyone. I bought my first small apartment with $12,350 I had saved from 2 years of working myself to the bone. My family sneered. They called it a dirty little hobby. They didn't realize that every hour of sleep I sacrificed was a brick in a fortress they would never be invited to enter. I was no longer the daughter they had discarded. I was the architect of a world they could only dream of. The witness stand was a stage, and Brittany Manning was the star performer. She sat there in a black designer dress that cost more than most people's cars, dabbing at her eyes with the practiced grace of a professional mourner. Her voice was a fragile whisper, calculated to pull at the heartstrings of everyone in that room. She spoke about our childhood, about the bond she claimed we still shared, and then she turned the knife. She told the judge that watching my decline was the greatest tragedy of her life. She leaned forward, her eyes brimming with counterfeit tears, and spoke specifically about the lakefront estate, $3,200,000. She described it not as my hard-earned sanctuary, but as a family legacy I had promised to our parents, Charles and Karen. In a rare moment of clarity, before my memory began to slip, to the gallery, she looked like a protective sister. To me, she looked like a predator circling a kill. While she performed for the court, Brian sat in the plaintiff's seat, his thumbs moving rapidly across his phone screen. I didn't need to see his display to know what he was doing. He was posting a heartbreaking update to his social media followers, spinning a narrative of family first and protecting Sydney. To garner sympathy from the Chicago Gold Coast elite, he was branding my autonomy as a sickness and their greed as a rescue mission. The comments were already pouring in, digital prayers for my health and praise for Brian's unwavering support. They were performing a social execution, and I was the guest of honor who hadn't been invited to the party. The betrayal reached its peak when I glanced at the legal folder Brian had left partially open on the table. Tucked behind the forged medical reports were floor plans and interior design invoices, $500,000 for custom furniture and imported marble, all destined for my house. They weren't just waiting for the judge's signature, they had already mentally moved in. They were picking out drapes for a bedroom they planned to steal from me while I was still standing in it. I watched my parents, Charles and Karen, nod in approval of Brittany's testimony. This was the normalization of their cruelty. The belief that I was merely a resource meant to fuel Brittany's socialite lifestyle. They had traded my reality for a comfortable fiction where I was a worthless burden who needed their guidance to manage my own wealth. I rubbed my eyes. But there was no panic, only a clinical clarity. I realized that my compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for far too long. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was an audit. Inside my leather portfolio, my attorney, Mr. Johnson, had the evidence that would turn their gaslight gala into a forensic crime scene. I didn't answer Brittany's tearful look. I just went back to my internal accounting. They thought they were finishing my real estate game, but they were actually signing the first page of their own eviction notices. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted as Mr. Johnson rose slowly to his feet. Unlike the flustered performance of the opposing counsel, his movements were calm and filled with a lethal confidence. From a massive leather briefcase, he produced a thick stack of meticulously organized files. That alone made the single forged contract Brian and Brittany had submitted look utterly insignificant. It was time for the professional escalation. The era of my silence was officially over. Mr. Johnson's voice rang out clearly, reaching every corner of the room. He told the judge that he would like to explain the asset portfolio of his client, Sydney Manning. I watched my father in the gallery. Confusion and panic were already beginning to cloud his face. Mr. Johnson started with the first property purchased 8 years ago, a studio apartment in the Old Town district. He explained that the down payment was saved entirely by me through working 3 jobs simultaneously. As the list continued, the color drained from Brian and Brittany's faces. They sat there, forced to calculate the sheer scale of the wealth I had quietly built while they were busy mocking me as a worthless burden. The second property was an office building downtown, purchased using rental income and further savings. Then the third, then the fourth. By the time he reached the 6th property, a high-yield apartment complex, the murmurs in the gallery were no longer about my alleged instability. They were about the invisible power player who had been shaping the local market right under their noses. I looked at Brittany. Her lips were trembling as if she had seen a ghost. Brian no longer had the composure to support her. He was glaring at his own lawyer with eyes that screamed useless. They realized that the boutiques Brittany frequented and the restaurants Brian used for his high-stakes dates were located in buildings I owned. The dazzling world they enjoyed merely as consumers was a world I had built as an owner. My success destroyed every curse they had ever placed on me. My very existence was a clinical rejection of their values. Mr. Johnson turned a page, the sound echoing in the silence like a closing door. He described the 10th property, known as the Riverside Lofts. Journalists in the gallery began taking notes frantically. That project had been a derelict eyesore the city had given up on until an anonymous investor, me, brought it back to life. It was now a landmark of the Gold Coast. I had poured 80% of my net worth into that gamble, enduring sleepless nights so I could eventually own the very ground they walked on. Judge Brown narrowed her eyes behind her glasses, leaning forward as the scattered dots of the family's lives were connected by hard data. She raised a hand to stop Mr. Johnson. Having seen enough to realize the fatal discrepancy in the plaintiff's claims, she turned a severe gaze toward Brian, Brittany, and their ashen-faced lawyer. She noted that my ownership of such a portfolio was entirely inconsistent with their claims of reckless spending or a lack of judgment. Then, Johnson delivered the decisive blow. He produced the final file for property number 12. He explained that this was the majestic industrial hub, the site of the original ancestral factory my parents had lost to bankruptcy years ago. I had bought it and restored it in secret. The courtroom air froze as the judge looked up and said, "One of the 12 properties, I see. I would love to take a look at it." That a plain girl, with no talent, was now the sovereign of their most cherished legacy. The silence in the courtroom was no longer heavy, it was suffocating. I watched the color drain from my sister's face, leaving her looking like a marble statue in a forgotten graveyard. Brian sat beside her, his smug grin now a frozen mask of terror. The judge's sudden interest in the 12th property in my portfolio had turned the room into a morgue for their pride. But Mr. Johnson was not finished. He adjusted his glasses with clinical precision and picked up the single piece of paper that anchored their entire case, the agreement where I had supposedly signed away my lakefront estate 1 year ago. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply held the document up as if it were a biohazard. He told the court that while the plaintiffs were busy fabricating a story of my mental instability and early onset memory loss, my team was focused on the physical reality of the evidence. We had commissioned a forensic materials analysis of this specific contract. He turned to face Brian and Brittany, his eyes as cold as a Chicago winter. He explained to the judge that the paper was standard, but the ink used to sign my name was a special high-security formulation with a traceable chemical signature. Mr. Johnson's voice rang through the room like a hammer on an anvil. He revealed the forensic result. That specific brand of security ink was released to the market exactly 3 months ago, yet, the date written on the contract in the judge's hand was 1 year ago. He asked the room a single, devastating question. Do the plaintiffs happen to own a time machine? Because that is the only way this document could have been signed 1 year ago with ink that did not exist until 90 days ago. A ripple of suppressed laughter spread through the gallery, followed by a sudden, sharp intake of breath from my mother. The logical armor they had built around their theft had turned into a cage. Beside the ink discrepancy, the handwriting analysis was just as lethal. Mr. Johnson submitted an expert report showing a probability of 98.7% that the signature was a crude forgery. I looked at Brittany. She let out a broken, sharp gasp. her hand trembling against her designer dress. Brian glared at her with a rage that confirmed exactly whose hand had held the pen. The fabricated image of a mentally unstable Sydney did not just crack, it vanished without a trace under the weight of undeniable evidence. They were not protecting me from my own instability. They were attempting to seize an empire they had no part in building. The criminal reality of the situation settled over the courtroom. Brian's ashen face was the only balance sheet I needed to see. The numbers were in, and they were bankrupt in every sense of the word. This was no longer a family dispute, it was a crime scene, and the forensic evidence had just delivered the kill shot. My father's pride, my sister's vanity, and Brian's greed were all trapped within those frozen ink molecules. The rational phase they had invented was a lie, and the memory loss they had diagnosed was a projection of their own blindness to my power. Judge Brown's voice cut through the remains of their dignity. Like a scalpel, she pronounced each word with a solemn resonance, declaring the petition dismissed in its entirety and referring the allegations of perjury and fraud to the prosecutorial authorities for immediate investigation. A sharp clatter echoed through the room as Brian's lawyer dropped his briefcase to the floor in total despair. Brian himself barely managed to stay upright, his face the color of wet ash as he realized his career and affluent lifestyle were ending in that very courtroom. Beside him, Brittany let out a broken, jagged sob that sounded like a dry branch snapping in the Chicago winter. My father and mother sat in the gallery, frozen as if struck by lightning, forced to confront the reality that the golden children they had championed were now criminals in the eyes of the law. The retreat of my brother-in-law was a spectacle of its own. Brian was immediately taken into custody by the bailiff for perjury and fraud, his pride stripped away as he was dragged from the room. Brittany received a suspended sentence, but in her world, it was an execution. Her social circle, which she valued more than her own sister, effectively exiled her within 24 hours. The boutiques she loved and the mansions she boasted about were gone, replaced by the crushing weight of public humiliation. Watching them, I realized the profound truth behind the illusion of power from an empty wallet. For 8 years, I had watched my family perform a theater of wealth and superiority, never realizing that their entire status was a luxury they had leased with my silence. Their authority was a performance that required a constant flow of external validation to exist. They had normalized treating me as a resource to be exploited because they lacked any internal foundation of their own. Now that my wealth was no longer their playground, they had no character to fall back on. They weren't just losing a lawsuit, they were losing the only identity they knew. Charles and Karen did not escape the audit. Mr. Johnson initiated a civil suit that stripped them of their remaining assets, forcing them to pay substantial damages for complicity and perjury. Every derogatory remark they had ever hurled at me was made public, and the Chicago media branded them as toxic parents who had envied their daughter's success. Their high-end furniture business saw customers vanish overnight as their reputation crumbled into dust. They were left with nothing but each other and the bitter poison of their own regret. Trapped in a prison of their own making, I met them one last time at property number 12, the majestic industrial hub. Standing in the restored ancestral factory, I handed them the final legal notice. They had 24 hours to vacate their rented lifestyle. My father looked at me with eyes that finally saw the talent he had dismissed, but it was too late for recognition to bridge the chasm between us. I had obtained permanent restraining orders against all of them, and my 12 properties were now under the protection of an ironclad trust management system. They had reaped exactly what they had sown. Standing alone in that tech hub, looking at the old brass plaque of my grandfather, I felt the true weight of letting go of bloodlines to find myself. I realized that the greatest victory wasn't the millions of dollars or the 12 fortresses I had built, it was the quiet courage to stop being the victim they needed me to be. I was no longer a discarded line item in their ledger, I was the architect of my own peace. I had chosen self-preservation over a toxic cycle, understanding that family isn't determined by DNA, but by the dignity and respect we give to one another. I pulled out my phone and looked at the group text from my mother. She had sent a single, desperate message. Sydney, please, we are family. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel a need for an explanation. I felt only clarity. This wasn't a family, it was a subscription I had finally decided to cancel. I hit delete conversation and blocked every number associated with that name. The silence that followed was the most expensive thing I had ever owned, and it was worth every sacrifice. My future begins now. Within the 12 fortresses I fought to protect. If this story reminded you that your worth isn't determined by those who can't see your potential, hit the share button. Let's build a community that celebrates the architects of their own lives.